listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's get ready to go against the grain. We have another good show for you today. We're going to start the first hour with a heartfelt conversation on the latest developments in the Minneapolis PD murder of unarmed African-American man George Floyd. The video of the killing went viral for its brutality, motivating thousands to come out into the streets to protest the injustice. Sean Blackman, co-host of By Any Means Necessary, will be joining us for what should be an engrossing conversation. We'll also discuss the Justice Department dropping the charges against the various senators that were caught stealing or selling their stocks after the COVID-19 intelligence briefing. We'll also continue in the vein of political corruption with a new report on Governor Andrew Cuomo taking donations from nursing home executives and giving those nursing homes a certain degree of immunity from legal, or let's say poor outcomes. Let's say legal immunity from poor outcomes. That story is mind-blowing, to put it mildly, but I guess it shouldn't be mind-blowing at all at this point. In the next hour, we'll get into foreign policy with the latest on the pro-democracy theocratic fascists that we backed in the Bolivian coup that removed the rightful president of the country, Evo Morales. We will discuss questions of censorship with a plucky story involving Twitter, the website itself, fact-checking a rather scandalous lie that Donald Trump and his team has been pushing on one Joe Scarborough. Issues of censorship are going to be pretty interesting in this conversation, and I would imagine that Donald Trump in no way ever engages those issues honestly and just goes immediately to rage. Last but not least, it is Wednesday. That means revelations. This is one of my favorite sections. Today, we're going to go with another sciencey thing. Last week, we had a really interesting science conversation, and I think we're going to do one on the double slit today. That should be really interesting, and I want to add a certain wrinkle into that with a NASA physicist named Tom Campbell, at the very least he used to be, where he gets into this notion of a virtual versus a materialistic world, trying to use the double slit in order to kind of make his point. But let's start here. I watched, as millions of you guys have watched, the latest video of cops murdering an unarmed, handcuffed African-American man in broad daylight in Minneapolis, Minnesota. In front of a growing and distraught crowd, several cops kneeled on George Floyd, with one, Derek Chauvin, driving his knee into George's throat. For 5 minutes, George pleaded for help until his gasp of "I can't breathe" fell silent, and in front of a flaccid audience, blinked out of existence. The video is disturbing on several counts, but I think the radical psychopathy that lingers eerily after the video ends was the most unsettling to me. George was subdued, he was unarmed, he was handcuffed, he was not a threat. Requests by a fighter in the crowd to check his vitals were summarily dismissed. Even when George was no longer speaking or moving, the murderer kept his knee on George's throat until they finally loaded him into the gurney. Word broke last night that 4 of the policemen involved have been fired, and with an investigation by the FBI and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension for possible civil rights violations. The Minneapolis Police Department characterized the murder as a quote-unquote medical incident, an opinion that I promise you is not shared by either myself or the thousands of other people that gathered last night at the place of his death in order to express their outrage and to demand justice. The thing is, justice doesn't entirely exist. There's vengeance, there's retribution, there's actions that disincentivize appropriation of a particular behavior for a society that may not necessarily be in the best interest of that society. But justice, that has to be something different. Ethereal, expansive, euphoric, absolute. Can the anguish in the murder of someone that you love be balanced by the punishment of the guilty? But that is what we tend to call justice in this society. More apropos, if it was only a couple of weeks ago that we watched an African-American jogger get chased down by a family of truckers or a family of people in a truck that basically chased him down and murdered him as he was jogging, making an argument that they were not necessarily standing their ground, but they basically murdered him in self-defense, despite the fact that they chased him down and hunted him down. The sister, the female that was in that group, took a picture of the dead body, the corpse, that her family members just created and put it on Snapchat saying, hey, I didn't see anything wrong with this. I wasn't thinking anything wrong about this at all. How depraved do you have to be for somebody to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't take a picture of the guy who you guys just murdered? Also, let's keep going with this. As if it wasn't disgusting enough, in early March, cops barged into the apartment with a no-knock search warrant, murdering Breonna Taylor and temporarily arresting the person that was defending the space from the hostile invasion. Or, for that matter, let's go to Texas, where a non-emergency found cops creeping around the perimeter of a house, firing through the glass window within seconds of seeing someone standing in their own home, killing 28-year-old Attila Jefferson. To put this in perspective, we've gotten to the point in our society where two different administrations in two different states, nearly a decade apart, have repeated atrocities as if the killing of George Floyd is a deja vu of the murder of Eric Garner, complete with handcuffs, choking, pleas for help, the distraught crowd not being able to do anything about it, and of course, the uttering of the words, I can't breathe. While I don't know what justice is, I know what it's not. How can we really use the term justice, even in approximation, when nothing has materially happened in our system to amend, adjust, or for that matter, to change the mechanics of these disastrous outcomes? Can there really be justice without political will or decisive action and retraining and aggressive prosecution of abuse, legislative constraints on power, mandatory body cameras, aggressive amelioration of inequalities, be it economic and health, and for that matter, access to the things that people need? It must be understood. A trial or prosecution in and of itself is not the epitome of justice. That is a trial. Justice requires something more. Justice requires your society to actually care that something is taking place that is utterly disastrous, that goes beyond just the hand-wringing that takes place when people end up losing their lives or when people end up getting killed, especially in situations like this where they take a bad ends on the middle of the street with everybody watching, video cameras, and either nobody gets prosecuted, nobody either gets arrested, or when somebody does get prosecuted, the person gets off. I don't know what justice looks like in this society because I got to be honest, I don't think I've seen it. And like I said, having a trial or a case here or there with one or two people being prosecuted here or there is not the same thing as having a system where you know your concerns are going to be honestly and legitimately dealt with, not because of an issue of color, not because of an issue of class, but because your society deems it necessary and valuable to do so. That is not what we have. I mean, keep in mind, the video where they chased that guy down, that video had to go viral before they ever made an arrest on that case. And even in the situation where they shot Jefferson through her window, think about what that means. The woman is standing in her own home and she's not even safe in her own home. Justice plays none of this. I understand that people are going to be screaming and crying for justice, and they should. They should be angry. They should be enraged. By the same token, maybe a larger conversation needs to take place on what justice actually looks like. And maybe we need to get away from this notion that one specific case where you're putting one specific person in prison doesn't necessarily change the entirety of a system that goes about doing this every day. You just don't catch it on video camera. Bob, I know you deal with a lot of this, especially in working on By Any Means Necessary. I know this was one of your main topics.
Yeah.
I used to do these topics all the time when I first started my channel. And I realized I could have did this every day. And every video was the same, with me just being really angry about having to deal with those videos. And you see this, and they basically put his knee, they choked the man to death by having his knee on the man's throat. No humanity was in this process. This wasn't a person that couldn't breathe, that I had my knee on his throat, that I know that they have a tendency to potentially die just like the other people did in the past. None of that. This was a person who I'm going to put my knee on his throat until we move him. And he died.
Yeah. I mean, that stuff's heavy, Jamar, and so my thoughts, obviously, having to see yourself reflected in these images is beyond anything I could ever comprehend as a white person in America. I couldn't imagine having to see the news and continue to see black and brown people brutalized like this by vigilantes or by police. So I sit here with a heavy heart to think about that, and then to continue to work in these spaces and to fight back against police. And I'm always amazed at people's strength to go out and protest. It's not an easy thing to join mass protest against police when police have just killed somebody that looked like you for an alleged crime. I mean, George Floyd was never found guilty of any crime.
That's right.
And yet there he was, killed by the police. And for me, this is where you're talking about, Jamal. There's so much to do. I mean, it's always interesting hearing all the politicians coming out and saying, this shows us so much about how far we have to go. And it's like, well, what's the end point? Where are you trying to go? When are we ever actually going to change the conversation or start to address these things? And that for me is like what's so frustrating, is because you could do these stories every day and you could have all the prayers and thoughts are with people. We have a long way to go. We need to address this. And then we never actually address these things. And I don't know if it's just the complexity of it, if it's so entrenched in our society, if we're brainwashed or conditioned into not actually responding. Is a big question. And to think about these police officers, Jamal, kind of what you said, there's a lack of humanity within them. And I always tell people, and I had to learn this myself, there's no point to talk to police officers. No. You can talk to them and ask questions and learn stuff, but you're never actually going to change an individual officer because they're just a cog in the machine. And what's so amazing about that moment, Jamal, and I'm curious your thought on this, is that even though people watch those police officers murder somebody, even those officers are now fired for having murdered somebody, and they'll most likely have charges brought against them for murdering somebody. If you were a bystander standing there and you tried to intervene to do anything to stop George Floyd from being murdered, you would have been arrested.
You would have been shot.
So in that situation, you have to watch somebody get murdered. There is nothing you can do as a citizen to say, I'm going to intervene, I'm going to push this cop off and save this man's life, because you would have saved this man's life. He would have gone to jail for resisting arrest. You would have gone for jail for attacking an officer. So there's not you basically are forced as a society to watch these officers in front of you commit murder and illegalities, and there's nothing we can do.
Or act in mass. I mean, if there are 100 people there, is that cop going to shoot all 100 people in order to keep beating Floyd?
But maybe.
I would like to see that.
If they have a gun, that's kind of the point. If they
Honestly,
have a gun and they're attacked, then yeah.
I would like to see that cop murder 100 people in order to continue to beat that person. That's what I want to see. I mean, I'm making the point, like, at a certain point, it becomes so ludicrous of the number of people that you have to murder in order to continue to, flagrantly abuse your job as a cop. I don't know what that looks like, right? Because it really does boil down to mass action versus individual action. If one person goes out, that person's going to get shot. If two people, those two people are going to get shot. 20? That's different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you have 1,000 people.
You don't know. I mean, I guess that's the problem with these officers, that they are trained in a way to escalate. It's incremental escalation. It's not about de-escalation. There is no officer of the peace. They're there to keep the peace, which means escalating anything they do to slightly escalate it more than anybody else. And if anybody else resists, they escalate. You go from the baton to the taser to the gun. There's a ladder that you climb up. And the idea is never to de-escalate until the other person de-escalates. So you're not even leading that situation. So it's terrifying, Jamal, to even have that scenario you're talking about. And the other thing I want to reference there is this shows, again, the fallacy of body cameras being the solution. Police are being filmed killing somebody.
Yes.
And that is not stopping them. The camera does not matter.
No, I mean, because they keep getting off. Like, that's what I mean when I say, like, it's a larger conversation, right? Because and this is why I think the other one would fail, the policy that we always talk about, reparations. That's why I think reparations fails. You can't even get people to come together and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be killing darkies like this. You can't even get political will for that. You basically have people wringing their hands. But in real world terms of, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? That's where you're at.
Yeah, let's talk more about this tomorrow. We have Sean Blackman, as we mentioned there, from By Any Means Necessary, joining us on the other side of the break. We do have a packed hour ahead of you, followed by another hour, Misfits. Thank you for joining us for 2 hours a day. In our first hour, though, we will be talking about the continued ripple effect caused by the police murder of George Floyd, the Justice Department ending their investigation into 3 U.S. senators who made very questionable investment decisions in relation to COVID-19, Andrew Cuomo giving immunity to big healthcare executives in New York, and huge bonus payouts to executives at the U.S. car rental company Hertz, despite having laid off thousands of its workers. And that's not enough. I alluded there. We have a second hour for you. We'll be here until 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune in to Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here.
Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
what's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamal Thomas on Radio Sputnik 105.5 FM in the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C. Give us a call. Phone lines are open, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. We continue our conversation today when we're joined by our good friend, the co-host of Radio Sputnik's By Any Means Necessary, Sean the Voice Blackman. Sean, what's happening?
Not a lot, man. Appreciate y'all having me on. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Jamal.
Sean, we appreciate you for taking the time. People can listen to your show along with the great Jackie Lukeman from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So don't turn the dial if you want to catch out Sean and Jackie later on this afternoon. Sean, thank you for joining us. We continue here to talk about the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the firing of 4 police officers who took part in the killing. Sean, let me just first ask, how are you feeling about this and what's been running through your head over the last 48 hours?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Bob. I mean, I've reached a point with incidents of racist police terror to where I wouldn't say that they don't affect me anymore and that they don't care. I wouldn't even say that I'm numb to it. But I've almost conditioned myself in a sense to where when these things happen, I kind of have a way of parsing my feelings about it to where I'm not like overcome. Because I mean, if you look at everything we've had back to back, I mean, and the George Floyd piece is really notable because now we're seeing these images and videos of police attacking protesters, these massive protests that happen in response to the killing, which gives it a whole other layer. But if you take Floyd police killing along with Ahmaud Arbery and Sean Reed and Breonna Taylor, it's just like if I were to sort of become sort of fully consumed with each and every incident, then I might very well just be, destroyed by it emotionally and mentally. But, as an organizer, as someone who, I need my faculties about me to be able to not only try to organize and resist against this sort of thing, but also in terms of my work by any means necessary. I mean, being able to, talk about these things and analyze them from a systemic level. So, for me, the struggle itself and sort of the work that I do is, what helps me keep my head and sort of in one piece emotionally and mentally.
Yeah, and Sean, I wanted to talk a little bit more about those images, especially as a white person asking for advice on how to process, how to share. I know there's a lot of our white friends out there who have been posting this. I know on my time feed there's been pictures. It's such a striking image to see that police officer there in Minneapolis with his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd. They're killing him. And so people share these images because I think there's a sense of if we share one, we just remember, we see, we acknowledge. But you also hope that those images would somehow shift the public consciousness around these images. But yet at the same time, we've had video of Eric Gardner. We have images of Philando Castile. We've had images of Rodney King now for decades. Hell, I mean, we even had Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old, on camera get shot by police officers. And we share all this imagery. We share all this outrage. But then it doesn't seemingly go anywhere. It doesn't prevent the next shooting. But yet we continue to see people share it. So I talk a little bit more about the power of images, how they're kind of used to maybe help the situation, how they hurt the situation. And if you're talking to the white folks out there listening to our show, what should their relationship be with these images of black people dying at the hands of vigilantes and police?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, you talked about shifting political consciousness. I mean, images are powerful, but images alone can't shift the consciousness in that way, in my humble opinion. I think that has to come from organizing. And for me, that's really the answer to your question even more broadly. I mean, every time, and also I want to point out on that same note, there was no video of, Mike Brown being killed in Ferguson, Missouri. There was no video of Trayvon Martin being killed in Sanford, although there was some audio, if I recall. But, the consciousness was something that was able to be directed in an organized way from the righteous rage that arose from it. And that's how we got the seeds for what became the movement for Black Lives, which still rolls on. Yeah, I know there's a lot of feelings around these videos and people sharing them. I mean, number one, realistically, I don't think people will ever actually stop sharing them. Every time, because what happens is the video gets posted, and then we get a chorus of people saying, well, you shouldn't post it for X, Y, Z reasons. And I'm not saying they're incorrect. I mean, it just kind of happening, you feel me? So, I mean, I think we should be realistic about it from that sense. And so, I don't know. For me, it's always like outrage is the easy part. I'm always just thinking about what is it that we can do? Because, I mean, as a person of conscience, the person of conscience, I think it's natural to want to expose injustice and things like that. And so I don't know, if I'm being honest, I feel kind of mixed about posting it. I personally, I haven't, when these videos come out, we don't watch them right away. I usually give it a while. I mean, to me, I kind of feel like it's my duty to actually see what happened, to be able to describe it, to sort of place it within the broader context of everything else that's happening. So for me, the values of these images are really valuable insofar they actually motivate us to do something about what it is we're seeing. Because if not, it really does just become trauma porn. It's not natural, and it's a sign of our times, I think, with the technology and things like that. But it's not healthy to sit around watching people get killed all day. But the danger there is being overtaken by sorrow, frustration to the point of being inactive, and all those sorts of things. I think we should always have an orientation of using that to sort of push us towards a productive end.
I think I agree with that. I mean, it's not so much that I think people should sit around and watch people get killed all day. We do that, I mean, when we watch movies or whatnot. But I think this is a little different. I mean, this is something where it's so real that it's almost surreal in the way that you're watching something like that unfold. I have to be honest. On issues like this, I kind of feel like you do, where not necessarily desensitized to it, but it happens so often where you can't have this kind of uneven keel when you engage this stuff, even though the stuff really does piss you off as you go about it, because you think to yourself, I can't believe our world is this way. Bob and I we always get in these conversations on reparations. And my argument is always, I agree with the argument. I mean, I agree with you on it. I don't know how to get it politically. And I have to be honest, it's stuff like this. Like, you have a situation where people are being shot, like a large number, and you have a vast disparity in regards to one part of the community that are being killed by cops versus another part. You have a clear disparity in the way that your police force and your court system engages one group based on color versus another group, and that's also along the lines of class. And it's like, how do you ever get that policy when you can't even get people to say, hey, can we just come together and say, let's not murder people and change our policing so these guys won't necessarily be on a hair trigger when they're engaging with the population? That just seems like it's off the table. Am I missing something on that?
Well, yeah, I was actually just thinking about, this is, maybe an aside, but like the Khalif Browder documentary that was on Netflix, it took me forever to even get around to watching that. Because, I mean, I knew how bad it was going to be, and I knew how emotionally taxing it was going to be. And we were discussing it on By Any Means Necessary back when it came out. And so I eventually watched it. And even that movie, When They See It's about the Central Park Five, I still haven't seen it. So it's that sort of thing in terms of that. But I mean, in truth, I think what we're really talking about. When we look at the issue of racist police terror, I think you have to really have a conversation about what role do the police play in a white supremacist capitalist society, because that's really the question. We know about the police's origins in the institution of slavery in this country. And so that essential role of, protecting property and maintaining that dynamic amongst property relations and being repressive really against all sectors of poor working and working class people. We know the cruelty and brutality the police use in terms of breaking up labor unions or at least labor struggles, I should say, and things like that, and being used as goon squads and those sorts of things. And in truth, we have to always bear in mind, I think, that there's a material basis for racist police terror. It's not an issue of cops riding around in the car consciously thinking about beating or killing black people. I'm sure some of them do. But it's sort of like when Bob was talking a moment ago about, the individual officers. Well, that's beside the point. That doesn't even really matter. Like in individualizing it, and I think this was his point, it sort of obscures the broader issue. The police as an institution is racist. Police as an institution is brutal. And the police as an institution is repressive. That is why they exist, and that is why don't see them punished more oftentimes than not. And the reason why we've even begun to see them punished to any extent here lately is only because of the heightened level of organizing and activism that's been going on over these past few years. But in truth, people are always asking, well, when will it end? When will it end? In truth, I think we'll only see the withering away of racist police terror as a phenomena when the system of capitalism itself no longer the dominant mode of production in the United States. Because it is that system that gives the police their mandate and their material basis for things that they do. It's the state that hands the police a life skill. You know what I mean? And so we definitely should push for justice in these individual cases. But we should also be clear that so there's a kind of complete systemic change that we will likely see these things continue to happen. And so the extent to which we're willing to organize as ever, I think, is the key part for me.
Yeah, and one of the main reasons this stuff continues is because we have a rigged election democracy system here in the United States that only allows us to theoretically basically choose between two parties at most ballots. And Sean, I know you guys have talked a lot on By Any Means Necessary about Joe Biden's comments last week when he said, well, I tell you what, if you have a problem figuring out whether you are for me or for Trump, then you ain't black. We talked a lot about it on the show as well. I was kind of curious your thoughts on it and the continued fallout from what Biden had said in his efforts to apologize or roll back what he said or people holding him accountable. But at the same time, I saw this headline today and I just kind of saw us going down the same path as we've gone down before, where you're kind of hitting your head against the wall saying, well, this clearly isn't the way to address this. The headline from the article was, quote, Ice Cube joins Charlemagne Diddy against Biden Democrats. Let's hold the black vote hostage until there's a black agenda we're satisfied with. Sean, obviously, I'm more than happy with that statement. I'm more than happy with people speaking up and trying to hold Biden and the Democrats accountable. But yet again, we turn to celebrities and we turn to kind of the salacious, clickbaity kind of conversation. And I see that the same thing after these police killings, that everything becomes so celebritized. You get the DeRay McKessons and Sean King arguing on the internets about God knows what at this point. And all of a sudden, Diddy and Charlemagne are somehow the voices for black politics in the United States. That seems like it's part of the process to keep us quiet, keep us distracted, keep us distracted by celebrity, and then we never can actually address the issues themselves.
Diddy is a clown. Charlemagne the God is a clown. I don't have any sort of deep issues with Ice Cube, but I mean, he's not someone that is renowned of being politically active in that way. I mean, P. Diddy is the same person who gave us, the vote or die campaign, a phrase that effectively means nothing at all. And he always, as a businessman, he's very keen on how he can sort of manipulate the moment to build a platform and things like that. And Charlemagne the God, is the host of a very popular hip hop show, of course, that, has lately been seeking, to sort of and increase its legitimacy. And what better way to do that than to have these conversations with running for president, be it Joe Biden in that case, or, they had Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and Cory Booker and all these sorts of people. But these people aren't serious, because what my question then is, well, what are they going to do besides saying, let's hold the black vote hostage? What does that even mean? There are already so many people in this country just straight up don't vote. There's so many disaffected voters in this country. There are already a lot of people who are already effectively holding their vote hostage because just been so discouraged by the whole electoral process. So with these celebrities, I mean, these are just platitudes. But, at the end of the day, if they're going to do something, I would bet any amount of money that what it's going to do in substance is to basically funnel, black people's vote right back to the Democratic Party. I mean, I don't see a scenario where P. Diddy, Charlemagne the God, and Ice Cube are going to help promote or donate or help build or organize a viable third-party candidate, or to, advocate for a change in a ballot access, or, so you're holding the black vote hostage to do what exactly? Yeah. It's just more nonsense, more famous people grandstanding. It don't mean nothing. It ain't gonna mean nothing. They're not gonna do nothing. And so, again, they're saying this 100% within the confines and constraints of the political mainstream. And so you can talk bad all you want, but I for one do not see a lot of substance coming from whatever it is.
Jamal, I'm curious on that note then, where that political voice comes from or what it looks like. And it's fascinating to see how history repeats itself if you don't pay attention to it. Yeah. And in 1964, at the Ballot of the Bullet speech Malcolm X gave, he said, quote, "They see that," and they're speaking to black voters here, "you're the ones who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to Texas, Cotton Patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House." So this is 1964, and yet we're still do them 50 years later in the exact same conversation, and yet we still don't return to Ice Cube, P. Diddy, and Charlemagne the God.
Think back to the old conversation that you and I had when we first started the show. And I think I made the point of saying, no, African Americans voted for Hillary Clinton to the tune of 90%. And I said they have power within the context of that party because they're voting in such large numbers. So they get a distinguishing factor in regards to who they put in. Whether it's a Carter G. Woodson go to the back door choice or not, it's still a choice to some degree, even if that choice is some degree this kind of propagandized choice. I love that quote. That quote is so on point, even going all the way back to the 50s, because he's absolutely right. You have a Democratic Party and you have blacks who follow this blackness leadership class right back into the Democratic Party. And I agree with you, Sean. I think these guys may pull out, but what do they mean when they say hold it? Hold it for what? What are you trying to get out of it? What is your stated objective? What are your stated goals? What are you trying to do as a multimillionaire that is going to somehow resonate with the other people in the population? I don't know what their political objectives are. And I think that's my issue with it. Not so much that I have an issue with them or people organizing themselves and saying, look, this is what I want. This is my demand. And you start at the very least with the demand, even if you don't have anywhere else to go. You start with the demand. But that's not where they're going. They're going with this kind of haphazard, all over the place thing. We're just going to hold our vote. What should they do? If P. Diddy called you up, Sean, and P. Diddy said, look, man, I heard your video. I was listening to Political Misfits. I like Bob and Thomas. I didn't necessarily like your comment about me, but that's okay. I'm going to be a bigger man. What should I do in order to somehow be some material benefit to my population or to my quote unquote tribe in trying to get various policies accomplished?
Well, I mean, the number one thing I would say, well, first of all, I would ask him precisely what he means, again, by the black vote hostage. And basically, I would say, well, you need to donate some of your fabulous wealth to X, Y, and Z. Give resources. Because clearly, P. Diddy is not a person who's, equipped to carry the struggle forward from an ideological standpoint or, from an organizing standpoint. And I mean, that's okay. Everybody doesn't have to be that person. But I mean, if you're really serious about doing something, there's a number of things that you can really do. But see, a part of my problem is that never seems to be any real forethought, just sloganeering, which is a characteristic failure, I would say, of political amateurism. You're just going to make a strong statement. The sheer force of that somehow going to change something, but it doesn't. You know what I mean? And so, you get these accolades for saying these things, having not done anything of substance. You know what I mean? And so, I feel like celebrities as people who, at least feigning some kind of political awareness is typically good for their brand. I mean, there's so many organizations at so many levels that could sorely need a lot of resources from someone like P. Diddy and someone of his means and things like that. So personally, I would probably instruct him to, first of all, clarity on what it is they're trying to do, and secondly, really support those organizations who are already on the ground doing this work. That's the beautiful thing about it. We ain't got to reinvent the wheel here. We don't necessarily have to start another organization or things like that. There are people who are working now and have been doing it. You could support this very moment as we speak. We already have the vision. You ain't got to have it. But, if you want to, slide something and into their donation joint, and that would be a great help, I would say.
Yeah, and that's why I'm always amazed at how celebrities are unable to connect with people. I used to produce By Any Means Necessary, and we had, I don't know, maybe 30 different Black Lives Matter representatives on from across the country in different cities. And so it's like little old me at our studio calling people and just doing some basic internet searching. And you can find all of the different chapters for the movement for Black Lives. You can find social justice people, legal people, nonprofits. It's not that the internet exists for a reason. And if you're Diddy or Charlamagne the God, you have staff that can find these people. It's not that hard. So there is no excuse to me when these celebrities just completely miss the mark on these things. They're just not thinking straight, and their egos get ahead of them a little bit there. Sean, we're unfortunately out of time with you. Sean, I'm a big fan of By Any Means Necessary. That's where I started here with Radio Sputnik. The show comes on after us here on Political Misfits from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. What are y'all covering today that our listeners might want to tune in to check out?
Well, we're also talking about the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis with Professor Alex Vitale, who wrote a book people may know called End of Policing. We're also touching on some calls to some U.S. arms trade deals from the U.S. government to the repressive government of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Also touching on some issues with Haiti, the U.S. deporting people positive with the coronavirus from the U.S. back to Haiti, and a lot of other things. So really encourage folks to check us out today and every day, Monday through Friday, 12 to 2 p.m. right here on Radio Sputnik.
Sean, well, thank you. I'll let you go ahead and rest your voice before you guys come on at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Before we turn to a break, I did want to get Charles on the line. He had called in, was patiently waiting. Charles, thanks for being with us today. What's on your mind?
Hey. So I had a few things on my mind, actually. I want to see like ads need to be compiled to the hypocrisies of the politicians. Like you'll see like a Joe Biden saying one thing and saying another. I think he ain't doing a good job in putting the information out there and making it resonate good enough. I know what would arouse me to add if I saw it. If I could see like hypocrisy flat out, like where he says one thing and says another thing. And I wanted to answer that question that Jamal has. He says it every time. Why won't Biden make any concessions if he really want to beat Trump? I can answer that because they don't really want to beat Trump. They only wanted to beat Bernie, and that mission is accomplished. They don't really care what happens here on out. There's this false notion that the Democrats really care about beating Trump. They don't care about beating Trump or Biden wins. The establishment stands as long as Bernie is out the way. The mission is accomplished for them already. It's all they really wanted to do, make sure Bernie didn't win. That was the goal, and that goal has been accomplished. They don't know why people think they care about winning against. It's a win-win for them.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Charles. Thank you for the call. As always, it's greatly appreciated. 202-521-1320. Yeah, I don't think Joe Biden team has much of a plan right now. They seem like they're trying out a ton of different messaging. Nothing's sticking. They haven't found their line of attack, and somehow Donald Trump is somehow responding better than Joe Biden is on the COVID-19 response, which is just like the most absurd thing to say. I'll agree with you, Charles, on your second point. I think the Democrats were trying to beat Bernie Sanders, and that was more important than them. I think the Democrats desperately want to beat Donald Trump, but I think the problem is the billionaires that have donated to the Democratic Party, they don't care. Well, they're the ones that could care less if it's Democrats or Republicans in power. And so I think there's kind of a second layer that's now unfolding. It's like, sure, the Democrats wanted to stop Sanders. They didn't have a plan after that. I think the Democrats want to win, Jamal, but I think the donors and the kind of the ruling class, they could care less if it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump.
I do think the Democrats want to win. I think they want to win without giving concessions, though. I think that's the catch. Meaning, if I can win this and not give anything up, then that's the way I'm going to try to win it. But but all things being equal, beating Sanders was far more important. The reason why I asked the question is not because I try to make the point of how ludicrous it is that you don't back a policy that has 88% support while also saying you want to unify the party. That's why I said, not because I believe they're going to jump on and do it. It's more so the reality, the ridiculousness of it. One last point, by the way. They also don't want to give concessions. Giving concessions sets a precedent going forward. Meaning, imagine if Joe Biden says, okay, I'll give you Medicare for all. Well, you've just lost something to the left. And now going forward, the left has in their head, okay, this is how negotiations are done. That's not something I think they want to, a precedent they want to set.
No, sadly, it is not, Jamar. Well, Jamar, with that, we do need to turn to a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of, kind of with Jamal Thomas. We continue to bring you brand new shows from our home. Big shout out to our engineers there, Dimitri, Ryan, Saul, and Andre, for keeping us on the air live with you. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. We are short staffed, so if they don't answer right away, do try to call back. We really appreciate hearing from all of you out there. We did want to quickly ask here, Jay, his thoughts on Floyd and reparations. Jay, thanks for calling in. What's on your mind?
Hey, what's going on, y'all? Thank you all for taking my call. I was hoping that Sean would still be on, because I wanted to ask him about the fact that a few years ago, the FBI had confirmed that U.S. the police force has been infiltrated by white supremacists. And, like, that's just a piece of it that no one ever really talked about in these conversations. And it certainly doesn't take you to be a card-carrying Klansman to gun down or just sit on top of an unarmed black man but until he dies. But I certainly do think that it would be helpful to have a audit of the police department to get as many of them out of the police department as possible, and to put in more, thorough research of these people before you just give them a badge and a gun. But also the topic of reparations, Jamal, I hear you. This conversation on reparations, and you don't know how to get it passed. The thing that I would say is just advocate. You advocate. You talk about reparations. That's how you get it passed. You get it and keep it in people's minds, and you talk about things that reparations could fix, like Black poverty. That for me is like the big thing, because, and also there's another element. I think that our educational system and the curriculum specifically is very it doesn't have any of the contributions that Black people have given to this country, either willingly or unwillingly, to make this country what it is. That it's lacking severely in the curriculum. So I think that that's something that could be fixed. But in terms of like us, you wouldn't say that about someone, trying to get the Green New Deal passed, even though this country has, for a very long time, shown itself to be anti-science and anti-everything else. You will still right beside.
I hear what you're saying, Jay. Yeah, Jay, let me cut you off there just because you jam-packed a lot of really great thoughts in there. You can give By Any Means Necessary a call at 3 p.m. when their line's open, 202-521-1320 to them. And we'll also continue to talk about George Floyd as the week goes on. And you make a very good point there about white supremacists on these police forces. One of the things that people don't realize is that oftentimes people that get fired, police officers that get fired for illegalities at one police station, are often hired at other jurisdictions because they've already gone through the training of becoming a police officer, Jamal. And it's crazy that the other police department says, oh, you're already trained, we wouldn't have to pay to train you. And so they'll oftentimes rehire these people. And there's stories about how these officers will actually kill somebody on the job and then they'll just be put back out on the streets. And then my last point, and then you can respond, Jamal, as you wish, is just the fact that police officers, think about what you want of them. And this is where I always try to push back on officers when they think I'm just coming at them like activists always are trying to take down police officers. It's not a healthy job for a police officer to be a police officer in America. They are basically having to police manufactured poverty. So there's a government in a state that is intentionally keeping certain amounts of people poor by not paying them fair wages or providing them any resources. And then the state is then hiring people to then police those people to keep them in that state of oppression. So you're basically putting them into an unsolvable situation that's going to completely destroy a police officer's mental capacity, Jamal, and then they're more likely to act irrationally or in a way that we wouldn't see as human because they've been put into these situations.
Yeah, so I agree with you on that. And I've had people who, they've heard videos that I've done on cops, and then they've heard me say stuff like that and be like, what? Am I talking to the same person? Yes, you're talking to the same person. It's like you have to accept they're human beings, right? And even in accepting that they're human beings, despite them doing things that are outright disastrous and horrible, they're still people who grew up in a society and a culture that, for whatever reason, they were indoctrinated into believing that that was the way the world was supposed to work. Meaning their police training didn't happen by God. It wasn't, it wasn't as a baby they just came across that particular way of thinking. No, they were trained in that way. And the caller makes reference to he wished that they would do an investigation. They did that. If you remember, when those killings took place under Obama, I think it was Gray in Baltimore. There was another one, I believe, in Ohio. I don't remember exact which one in Ohio. I think it was Brown, but I'm not exactly sure. But if you remember, Obama sent the God, what is his name? He sent the DA to the I can't think of his name. Powell. He sent Powell.
Holder?
Holder, that's it. I'm sorry. He sent Holder to basically do an investigation in the various places, and they created 2 reports. Those reports, 2 completely different states, basically came up with the same report. These people basically have certain racist policies. They tend to over-police certain areas that tend to be poor and tend to be unfortunate. Meaning, even if you had a situation where whites and black use the same amount of drugs, well, just because of the way they police, you're going to get more blacks in general. Like, that came up over and over again. It didn't matter where. It was kind of just the way they went about their trainings. And one last point, the New Deal. There's a difference between the New Deal and pushing for reparations. One is that the New Deal was made to exclude blacks. So there's one. But on the other one, let's say that wasn't the case. A policy that goes across the board has an easier chance of trying to get over the finish line as opposed to a policy that is very specific to a section of that population. And a section of that population that tends to be maligned, tends to be attacked. We can be killed by cops and nobody cares. You can have 3 times more end up dying, and the population still says, hey, let's open this economy up. It's not us that are being hit. I have a hard time believing that that takes place in a society like this that, I got to be honest, I don't think has a high value on African Americans' lives. I don't know how the argument is made to me that what I'm saying is wrong in regards to this value on life when you look at a society that says, yes, you can kill this person and totally get away with it.
Yeah. The former Attorney General Eric Holder is the Democrats' lead committee member on the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. And I just think people need to just realize the Democratic Party are deeply entrenched with the same political actors that have failed to act in the past, and then they're promoted to continued positions where they will fail to continue to act. I want to stay on this topic. We do have more callers, so I have quite a bit of other news, but this is an important moment to reflect on. Let's first get here to Anthony. Anthony, you're on the line here with Political Misfits, 202-521-1320. Anthony, what's on your mind today?
Hey, what's going on, y'all? I was just curious with, you got to do something for the black vote thing, the whole P. Diddy, Ice Cube thing, and the parallels with, I think it was the Sunrise Movement. I don't know who it was before. They also did something similar, but with them, it wasn't you're not going to get our vote. It was more like we'd like it if you make some concessions. I'm curious where you guys what are you guys' thoughts on how to actually make that useful? And if it doesn't play out, would you still vote for? I mean, Jamal, I think both of you, I think it's pretty obvious, probably not. But what is the argument for not voting for Joe Biden? Considering I would step on a controversial grounds here and go so far as to say, is he really the lesser of the two evils, considering how Bill Clinton, all the way back to Bill Clinton and the Obama administration, and Bush obviously as well, those are the 3 big administrations that got us here, and 2 of those are Democrats themselves. So, is he ultimately the lesser evil?
Yeah, quite a few calls backing up here, Jamal. Just go ahead and respond to that before we get to the next one.
So the question on whether or not Joe Biden is a lesser evil, I honestly really do believe that the question should be asked in somewhat of a different way. If indeed Medicare for All has 88% approval, how does the Democratic Party not justify accepting Medicare for All if indeed unifies the party? They need to explain that, because that's a mind-blowing thing to have a unanimous choice of people saying, yes, we agree with this, and these guys don't do it. Look, the point I would make about this not being the least worst, I don't think Joe Biden is the least worst. I think Joe Biden is the worst. The problem that you get is over the course of time, all of these people like the Sam Cedars of the world or the Cenk Uygurs of the world, they'll try to get you to look at elections as these very narrow-focused things where you're just looking at these very specific things, missing the point that over the context of time, your political system is moving further and further and further to the right. You've gotten rid of all notions of accountability. You've gotten all notions of standards of saying, okay, this is the least I'm willing to accept. Out the window. If they're blue, it doesn't really matter what they're pushing for in regards to policy. They're not Republicans, so just vote for them. That's lunacy. And not only has that hurt you in regards to how people view lefties, because they haven't seen, they look at this incremental nonsense and they say, okay, well, our government don't do big things anymore, can't do big things anymore. But you also cut the number of people who actually vote for your party, because those people get disenchanted with the political process. That's why you have the majority of people who are don't vote, are disproportionately under $30,000 a year, and people.
Well, I think that's kind of the point to it is the fact that if everything is kind of focused on the one vote for president, I think we're missing kind of the bigger picture of what's happening in the United States. Is that there's an over-reliance on centralized government. We have more and more people shifting to the right in this hyper-individualization, that we're definitely missing kind of the need for local decentralized organizing, neighborhood, door to door, to actually build small communities to wield political power. But we basically kind of sat back and turned off our focus. And on the point, I would disagree. I don't know, whatever the argument was, is Donald Trump somehow less worse than Joe Biden? I would disagree with that. I wouldn't want to argue it or put a lot of money on it or get really worked up about it. But you get 4,000 some political appointees. You hire hundreds of thousands of people to come in for the federal government when you're running an administration. I would better trust the Democratic Party to stack the U.S. empire for whatever it's worth, it's a lesser of two evils, not a great debate, but I would have a hard time thinking that those administrations were any better under Donald Trump than they would be under a Democrat. I don't know if that's necessarily worth the argument or what our caller was
We can have the
getting
argument
to,
on Friday, because I disagree with that. I totally disagree with
Okay.
that. Yeah, so let's have the
You're
argument
gonna
on Friday. That's a
argue
good
with me
conversation.
That the EPA under the Republican Party is in better conditions than it would be under the Democratic Party.
No, that's not my argument. My argument
But it's
is
the administration. I guess that's what I'm saying. The administration writ large under Biden versus under a Trump. I guess you have to think in each of the different cabinet level positions, each of the different departments where I don't trust Democrats, but more than I would a Republican.
Yeah, I don't trust either. I think my issue is we get this kind of anesthetized way of dealing with our politics, where Obama makes people feel okay despite the fact that Obama is doing basically similar things that Trump is doing. Or for that matter, Clinton makes people feel okay despite the fact that he's getting rid of Glass-Steagall. I mean, Glass-Steagall literally caused the economic crash.
Yeah, we can argue. Let me slide in this, not to cut you off. Let me slide you're fine. Before we get to the end of, we're not going to be able to take any callers here, but I did want to get Pam in. We got about 30 seconds where we can take the call. Pam, are you still here with us?
Yes, I am. We try to be quick. I don't want to spread, antagonism amongst people, but I listen to Fault Lines in the morning, and Lee Stranahan has had the most outrageous take on the Aubrey murder. He claimed he was a felon. It's a justified homicide. It's outrageous, and Nixon is not responding that strongly. And then this morning, he was justifying this murder in Minneapolis. I've never seen a more cold-blooded, hands-on murder on video. It's the most horrific thing. And although we see a lot of violence perpetrated by cops against civilians,
still there?
Never seen it. Me? Are you hearing me?
Yeah, make your point here, Pam, before we'll have to let you go.
I think that Lee Stranahan needs to be held to account. He's getting away with promoting the GOP talking points. I heard when talk radio started, I lived in Atlanta, I heard their vile racism because I tried to practice patience. I can't call in there because it makes me too angry now that I'm older. I don't have the patience.
Yeah, Pam, thank you for calling in here. We hope you continue to have a conversation with us, not the same conversation there. I can't speak for Lee Stranahan. I can speak for Radio Sputnik that we value the diversity of voice that is on the station. So I do hope you can find the patience to call in there and to continue to share your thoughts with him. Jamarl Thomas, continuing to talk here ahead of our 1 p.m. break. We have another hour of news. You can give us a call, 202-521-1320, to continue the conversation, whatever is on your mind. Jamarl, let's outro with a hard pivot here, if you don't mind. I know you love polls and you're pretty good at guessing at numbers. There's a new AP NORC Center for Public Affairs research poll out today. Quickly, Jamarl, what % of people polled in this latest poll would take a vaccine against the coronavirus when it becomes available?
35%.
35%. The answer is 49%.
Close.
A little bit higher. There you go. What % of people said they would refuse to take the vaccine?
20%.
Nailed it on the head, Jamarl.
Did I? Nice. Oh, nice.
You got 31% of people saying they are unsure if they would take the vaccine. The last question here, what % of people said they thought a vaccine would be out this year, in the year 2020?
Maybe 5? I mean, there's no way that's a lot. Maybe 10%. 10%.
All right, 21% of people said they thought it would be out this year. 61% said next year. Jamarl Thomas, I guess my question for you, Jamarl Thomas, if the vaccine comes out in a few months here, are you taking it?
Probably not. I don't think I'm taking it anytime soon. I mean, I'll see how everyone else does, but I don't think I'm going to take it. What about you? Are you going to take it?
I haven't gotten the flu shot in a long time, so I'm probably going to be skeptical about it until there's some more thoughts on it.
Yeah, right. I was like, let's let that peruse for a bit, make sure everybody else is okay before I start taking it. That's awesome. So that was a great segment. With that, we're out of time. We are going, in the next segment, going to be discussing or having a conversation with Ben Norden, investigative journalist and assistant editor of the independent news website, The Gray Zone. With that, we'll be right back after a short break.
Hello? Hey, Ben, can you hear me?
Hey, yeah, how's it going?
History Untold.
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. We have lots to cover over the next hour, including what's happening in Brazil and Bolivia, and what's going on in the three-way battle royale between Twitter, Trump, and one Joe Scarborough. That story is utterly hilarious. As always, your calls and tweets are amply appreciated. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So in November 2019, President of Bolivia, Evo Morales, was deposed from power in a violent coup by corporate and theocratic forces in the country with an assist from Western asset, the OAS, the Organization for American States. Evo won the election by a scorching 10 points. The rumor released by the OAS was that the election was dodgy, and Western media basically took it as a flat fact and ran with it. That created enough chaos and destabilization for the right-wing elements in the country to organize and basically take over. Now, we love our freedom in this country, and so we were backing the freedom-loving fascists as they basically destroyed social and economic gains made by the masses for that country under Evo's leadership. To discuss the latest in Bolivia, we're joined by Ben Norden, an investigative journalist and assistant editor for the independent news website The Gray Zone. Ben, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Ben, is there anything you want to add to me explaining that? I just gave basic explanation. I think much of the audience gets the gist of it, but if there's anything else you want to add additional context to it, please feel free.
Yeah, you did a great job of summarizing the kind of basics of the coup. Of course, what we should keep in mind is that the United States has backed dozens of very similar military coups throughout Latin America over the past 200 years since the declaration of the infamous Monroe Doctrine, in which the U.S. government effectively declared that Latin America is its colonial backyard and that it belongs to Uncle Sam. And this coup in Bolivia really is remarkably similar in a lot of ways to the famous coup, the infamous coup on 9/11, 1973 in Chile.
That's right.
People might be familiar with that coup, the infamous CIA coup that ousted the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende, who was later killed that night in the first 9/11, if you will, the September 11th, 1973 coup in Chile. So the coup in Bolivia very much follows the same kind of pattern. You have a democratically elected socialist leader, Evo Morales, but also further compounding that is that Bolivia is a largely indigenous country. About 2/3 of the population is indigenous. Now, that is another key factor and key facet of this military coup that we have to understand. It's different from the Chile coup because Bolivia has a long history of racism, of colonialism against the majority indigenous population who was dispossessed, who was not represented in the political system for decades. Evo Morales was the first indigenous president in a majority indigenous country. So it was a hugely important symbolic, and not just symbolic, presence, because his government also made so many strides fighting on behalf of indigenous rights. So it's not even just that the U.S. helped depose a socialist, a progressive, and anti-imperialist. That's very important too. But also, as you mentioned, the military coup installed these theocratic forces that are also deeply racist and that consider themselves white, which is also kind of ironic because to white supremacists in the U.S., they wouldn't be considered white, but to the racist Bolivian elite, who also consider themselves deeply Christian, they see the indigenous majority as these satanic, barbaric hordes. So unfortunately, there's so many echoes, not only of the kind of U.S. neo-colonial history, but there are also many terrifying historical echoes of Spanish old school colonialism that sees the indigenous majority just as these hordes that need to be gotten rid of. It's absolutely horrific.
Yeah, I was watching when the coup unfolded, and Evo won by 10 points. Like, Americans will have a hard time grasping what that looks like for a president to win an election by like 10 points. I mean, what did Trump win by? I mean, it was like most of our elections are like maybe 2 or 3 percentage point difference. I mean, 10 points is a massive win. And they were able to basically undermine that election and steal that election from him. And like you said, making gains. It wasn't just him taking power. He had been in power for, 15, 20 years or something? Like, he basically was in for as long as Angela Merkel. What gains were lost the moment that Evo was taken out of that seat? Meaning, what were the gains that Evo was able to make, or the strides that he was able to make in that country versus the strides that have basically been rolled back with the taking of that country?
Well, of course, we should mention that Trump and Bush Jr. really didn't even win. It just shows how undemocratic the U.S. electoral system is, and that they were still president. But aside from that, you raise a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned Angela Merkel, because actually Evo Morales was in power for less than her, fewer years than her. 13 years he was in power democratically. He had governed 3 presidential terms, and in fact, he didn't even finish his constitutionally mandated 3rd term before he was ousted in a military coup. Now, let's keep in mind, you mentioned the Organization of American States. The role of the OAS in this coup is crucial because the OAS provided the kind of legal justification for what is clearly an illegal military coup. Now, what did the OAS say? The OAS, their argument rested on 2 parameters. The OAS claimed that Evo Morales was a dictator or dictatorial because he was running for a 4th term, even though, of course, what the OAS didn't mention is that the Bolivian Supreme Court, the Electoral Court, allowed him to run for a 4th term. So his run was completely legal, even though that he had narrowly lost a referendum. And so that was part of their justification, which is clearly ridiculous because, again, the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, the court, allowed him to run. The other claim that they had was that he didn't actually win by the 10% that was needed to win in the first round, because like many countries, Bolivia's presidential system, the election has 2 rounds. If one of the candidates gets over 50% of the vote, or if they get 10% more than the second place candidate, they win in the first round and don't have to go to a runoff. Now, Evo Morales won by slightly over 10%, but the OAS falsely claimed that he was leading by like 9%, and then the power went out, and then he somehow, they stuffed all the ballots to give him 10%. That's not at all what happened. What happened is that the OAS made that claim before many of the rural areas had their votes counted. And of course, the rural areas are mostly indigenous and tend to be pro-Evo Morales, and they support his party, the Movement Towards Socialism Party. So clearly, the urban vote would have been largely not as pro-Evo, and the rural vote would have been more pro-Evo. So as the vote comes in later in the night, it's going to become more and more Evo, and then the lead he has is going to increase. Of course, they didn't wait for that because they knew that he was going to win by 10%, so they played their card immediately, and that led to the entire coup, which was totally backed by the Trump administration 100%. Now, one other key point about this. You mentioned Angela Merkel. Right. Angela Merkel has served more years in office than Evo Morales, and you never hear international institutions dispute the legitimacy of the German elections. So this is clearly an absolutely ridiculous claim that Evo Morales was somehow a dictator or authoritarian. He won 3 presidential elections, and then he won the 4th presidential election, but was not allowed to serve his term. And it was not because he supposedly was anti-democratic. It was because the U.S. government and the right-wing opposition in Bolivia conspired together to overthrow him undemocratically. And today, Bolivia does not have a democracy. It has a dictatorship.
So what's the latest news on what's taking place in Bolivia? There's been news that basically has recent the extension of the coup and like you said, the rollback of the policy reforms that Evo was able to make in the country. So what is taking place in lieu of basically the Evo government falling apart?
Well, of course, immediately the night of the coup and then after the coup regime and the coup mongers that it backed, the violent far-right forces on the ground, they violently purged Evo Morales' party, which is called the Movement Towards Socialism Party. And they violently, that included attacking members of the party, burning down the houses of party members, physically exiling party members, arresting them in a violent purge. And this was totally backed to the hilt by Washington and the Trump administration and the Mike Pompeo State Department specifically. And then after purging Mas's party, they claimed that this far-right extremist racist Christian fundamentalist, Jeanine Áñez, is supposedly the legitimate interim president because supposedly she is part of the presidential line of descent. Of course, what they don't mention is that they purged everyone above her, and there were like 5 people above her, including the vice president, the president of the Legislative Assembly. They purged everyone, and so they could get to her and say that somehow she has the legal right to be interim president. But they also claimed that they were going to have an election, which should have already taken place. But, of course, with coronavirus, they delayed the election indefinitely. It gave them the convenient excuse to just not have the election. So even according to their own totally ridiculous legal justification, Jeanine Áñez has absolutely zero legal right to be the so-called interim president right now. She is 100% a dictator, not only according to the obvious reality, but even according to what they themselves claim, given their fake legal justification. And not only that, of course, I should mention that dozens of protesters were massacred. Largely indigenous protesters were massacred by the coup regime in massive protests immediately after the coup. But the military has continued violently repressing the population to such a cartoonish degree that this past week, the Bolivian military in uniform, the main commander, this general, and the military forces entered the Legislative Assembly, which is the main constitutional congressional body inside Bolivia. The military entered the Congress and threatened the lawmakers, saying that if they don't vote to increase the salaries of military officers and increase the funding for the military forces, that they said that they were going to do it themselves. We don't really know exactly what that means, but we're supposed to believe that this is a democracy. The U.S. government and the OAS, which is a right-wing puppet of Washington, they claim that they restored democracy in Bolivia. And what kind of democracy does the military enter the Congress and threaten lawmakers and say, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to do it ourselves?
Yeah, Ben, I was also curious there. You mentioned the role of the Catholic Church, and it had me thinking we were going to cover later in the show about Steve Bannon there in Italy getting the approval to go ahead and set up a Catholic political institution. Obviously, right-wing fundamental religion here in the United States, the evangelical vote has played a major role in the political landscape, but in many ways it's really quiet, and the Catholic Church in many ways politically has somehow been really quiet. But even in Virginia here, in our own backyard, the Bolivian community is very entrenched within the Catholic Church, and in those communities, what role is the Catholic Church and religion playing in some of these right-wing shifts across the globe, and then more specifically there in Latin America?
Well, absolutely in Bolivia, Catholicism and Christianity in general played a key role. Now, one of the things about Bolivia that makes it even more of a touchy issue is that it's tied to race relations. As I said, in Bolivia, this is a 2/3 indigenous country. And although there certainly are indigenous Christians, many indigenous Bolivians still practice some kind of more traditional religion or they're not really religious. In the case of Evo Morales, it was widely suspected that he's probably an atheist, but he would reference Christianity in a positive way, in a kind of liberation theology perspective in his speeches, and he would also sometimes reference indigenous religious customs. So what happens in Bolivia is that religion also becomes kind of a stand-in for race. So the majority of the white what they consider white in Latin America, which would ironically not be considered white in the US, even though many of these people are in Latin America, these racist right-wingers, they consider themselves white. And that's a whole long conversation, but that explains how you have neo-Nazis in Bolivia and neo-Nazis in Brazil and neo-Nazis in Chile. But anyway, aside from that really strange, the fact that you have Latino neo-Nazis, but in Bolivia, what's considered the white population is largely Christian. So if you listen to the speeches of Jeanine Áñez, the coup so-called president, or the kind of far-right fascist muscle behind the coup, leaders like Camacho, Luis Fernando Camacho in Bolivia, if you listen to their speeches, they conflate religion with whiteness. And they say, so for instance, when Camacho in the violent coup attempt took over the presidential palace, he kneeled down on the ground in the presidential palace with a Bible next to a pastor who declared, he shouted, "Bolivia belongs to Christ. Never again will Pachamama, the indigenous mother spirit, enter the presidential palace." So you see the conflation there. And Jeanine Áñez, the fake coup president, she has tweeted racist comments saying that the indigenous majority are satanic hordes who need to return to the countryside with their satanic beliefs. So that's a bit different in other countries, especially in Brazil, which also has a fascist regime under Bolsonaro, where their evangelical Christianity in particular, which also has racist elements against the majority black population, evangelical Christianity in Brazil has been a major force behind the far right. Whereas in Bolivia, there still isn't a big evangelical population, although there is a growing one, but it's mostly Catholic, and it's associated with these, not only, I mean, there are more progressive Catholics, but there are a lot of these white racist Bolivian Catholics. And then there's also, which I don't even have time to get into, there are the descendants of Nazi collaborators who fled toward the end of World War II, especially from Croatia, but also Germany and other parts of Europe and Eastern Europe. They realized that the Nazis were going to lose, so they fled to Latin America. And one of the countries they chose to immigrate to was Bolivia. So there still are descendants of Croatian members of the Ustasha, who were Croatian fascists who collaborated with the Nazis. And they represent a significant part of the Bolivian political elite and also helped to fund and back this coup attempt. This coup that unfortunately succeeded.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating. And this is going to be a hard pivot, going from foreign policy to domestic policy. There's a weird story that has been taking place in the United States where Donald Trump has basically gone to war with Joe Scarborough, who then, in turn, Donald Trump goes to war with Twitter in perpetuating the war with Joe Scarborough. So let me just read it. It's really bizarre. So another strange Twitter story that has emerged over the course of the last couple of weeks is the battle between Trump and Joe Scarborough, not over the coronavirus or ratings of the usual stuff, but murder. Murder, I tell you. In a story, I guess everyone had forgotten, nearly 19 years ago, Joe Scarborough was actually a member of Congress representing Florida. Now, during his term, one of his staffers died while working in his office in Florida. Now, Trump has discovered the story and keeps referring to it as a quote-unquote cold case, calling for the mystery to be investigated. Now, he is basically accusing quote-unquote Psycho Joe of having something to do with a woman's death. Now, eventually, the woman's husband got involved, writing a letter to Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey saying, "Look, my wife has had an undiagnosed heart condition. She fainted, she hit her head hard, she died in a terrible accident." It was investigated at the time. He's calling on Dorsey to recognize the tweets and spreading the spreading of the misinformation with these tweets about his wife, and basically to censor these tweets and be selective about it. Now, some of these tweets, just to read, just so people can understand what's being said. Donald Trump: the opening of the cold case against Psycho Joe Scarborough was not a Donald Trump original thought. This has been going on for years, long before I joined the chorus in 2016, when Joe and his wacky future ex-wife Mika would endlessly interview me. I would always be thinking. And then he continues about whether or not Joe could have done such a horrible thing. Maybe, maybe not, but I find Joe to be a total nut job, and I knew him far better than most. So many unanswered and obvious questions, but I won't bring them up now. Law enforcement eventually will. Ben, this is out there. Now, the catch becomes, what does Twitter supposed to do with the situation? Because Dorsey, or the husband, has a point, right? This isn't Trump just bringing up something that is subjective. This is Trump bringing up something that is patently wrong. And yet, Twitter is in this kind of weird box of, okay, what do I do about it? So Dorsey has basically fact-checked Donald Trump, to which Donald Trump has gone hysterical. Now, I'm asking you this question on censorship. What should Twitter do here? Do you believe Twitter should go in and should make an adjustment to put that fact check on? Do you think Twitter should remove the content? Or do you think Twitter should just be hands off and just allow the platform to be what the platform is, whether it's true or not?
No, I do not think, and I hope that people agree, Twitter should remove any of these tweets or make any notes. No, because that's going to open a dangerous can of worms, a Pandora's box. I mean, look, the president, the U.S. president, lies every single day, multiple times a day. So what are they supposed to do? Just every time he tweets, delete it? Every time he tweets, put a fact check? And who's going to fact check? Because the issue with this has been a concern going back many years now, and many neoliberal Democrats have jumped on board saying that we need so-called independent fact checkers to censor alternative media and alternative voices on social media. Now, of course, we're not talking about the president in that case, but we've seen how these so-called independent fact checkers have effectively censored information that the U.S. government doesn't like by claiming that it's disinformation, by claiming that it's Russian propaganda. So when it comes to the president saying demonstrably false things, okay, these are clearly lies. This is clearly outrageous and ridiculous. But is it really any different from the other lies and ridiculous and outrageous comments that Trump says on a daily basis? I mean, let's keep in mind, the president just went on TV a few weeks ago and suggested that people should inject disinfectant. And then after he said that, there was a massive increase in calls to poison control,
yes,
and even cases of potential death or hospitalization. So what are we supposed to have social media outlets publish a notice every time he tweets something?
That's a good point. Bob, what about you? Should Twitter have taken this step of basically fact-checking Donald Trump? And what does this mean going forward? Like, what gets fact-checked and what doesn't? And is it only things that Donald Trump put out that gets fact-checked? This seems untenable.
Yeah, and just to add the other layer of news there, Donald Trump was fact-checked by Twitter for the first time, where they said, you probably should read more information on this, after Donald Trump had basically said the mail-in ballots were going to be completely stolen, fraudulent, corrupted, all of these different things about what doesn't actually happen with mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots, there's very little fraud in the United States when it comes to voting. So whenever you hear that, people saying that there's a lot of voter suppression, which is basically what Donald Trump was doing. He's basically saying, don't trust this. Nobody can trust this. The whole thing is rigged, and you should basically move back. And then in Trump's response, Donald Trump says, Twitter has now shown that everything we have been saying about them and their compatriots is correct. Big action to follow about 10:30 a.m. today. So he's going to say there's some type of social media regulation coming out. I think that's hard to believe. I mean, I think we've covered on this show quite a bit about how Peter Thiel and the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Jack Dorseys are more than happy to continue to placate Donald Trump because they make so much money off of the guy that they need him, and they basically don't want any regulations. And if they can kind of make a deal with Trump, they're more than happy to be appeased. So I think this is a lot of smoke. I don't think anything's going to come from this. And then as Ben's saying, no, I don't think that there should be a removal of these items because, one, there's no way to police the entire internet. I think we should police who's running our internet, and the Facebooks and the Googles of the world have gotten way too wealthy and way too much power. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is one of the most politically influential people in this country, and he's just some white nerdy dude who started off by ranking the looks of women on an internet website in college. Like, that's not okay. And so I think it's more about addressing who is actually running these systems and has the levers of control more than it is about the individual users who are then coming on those platforms. But that's just where I'm at. I don't know, Ben, what do you think about that?
You said it perfectly. I agree 100%. Look, with a lot of these cases, especially neoliberal Democrats, but in general, a lot of Americans are looking for easy solutions that don't blame the source of power, especially because the Democratic Party is largely funded by these corporate interests, by these massive big tech corporations. So instead of dealing with the fundamental problem that, oh yeah, the US president is a pathological liar who on a daily basis says demonstrably false things, instead of dealing with that, we say, well, we can't beat him. And in fact, we have someone who is just as much of a pathological liar, Joe Biden, who's our candidate. So instead of actually having changes to the political system, we're just going to work with these big tech corporations that also fund our party and work together to censor information that we don't like so we can continue living in this bubble where we pretend that the U.S. president is not a pathological liar. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous, honestly. And it's also just a political distraction from the actual crimes that Trump is overseeing on a daily basis. I mean, like you mentioned, voter suppression is a much more serious case. But him tweeting some stupid comments about an MSNBC host, this is just dumb political drama that large corporate media outlets like to talk about because it gets more clicks and they get ad revenue.
There's the secondary part to this also, that media discredits itself. Like, Donald Trump wouldn't necessarily be considered a source of information if media had more credibility. I mean, these guys ran with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They ran with the Syrian chemical weapons strike. They ran with Brian Williams, who was a flagrant liar who got fired from one job for lying and then brought the guy back on back on the television station. Rachel Maddow. Oh my God, Rachel Maddow. So you had these guys who basically went with these stories that just weren't true. I mean, Fox News does the same thing. It's almost like a red and blue team where these guys come up with their own version of reality where the blue team just kind of believes the blue team, the red team believes the red team, and they never have any ability to actually make any headway because they're in their own bubbles on this stuff. Do you think that the credibility of media itself contributed to this kind of, you could say, the failing or the fake news thing, where people start looking at news and not being able to discern what's real and what's fake within the context of that news?
Absolutely, but let's keep in mind that if you looked at polls going back years, I'm talking more than 10 years back, even further, well before Donald Trump was president, there was already widespread distrust of the media in the U.S., and rightfully. I mean, let's not forget the infamous WMD scandal. But there's been so many other cases since then. The corporate media has lied again and again and again, pushing U.S. government disinformation to justify whatever war Washington wants to wage this week. And we saw this, the most blatant example, with Russiagate, which only further just completely wrecked popular American trust in the media. So this isn't a new problem with Donald Trump. It's just gotten to such a cartoonish level at this point that people understandably just don't believe what they see on TV. And unfortunately, you have far-right demagogues like Donald Trump exploiting that cynicism, exploiting that lack of confidence to push actual lies, actual fake news. But at the same time, it's not like the media is any better because, yeah, sure, the Trump administration is fundamentally based on all of these lies, but so is the Democratic Party, so is Russiagate. And until we actually have a political movement and an alternative media that is willing to challenge full frontally both of those sets of lies, the Democratic Party's lies and the Republican Party's lies, no one is going to really have confidence or faith in them, and it's just going to continue to fuel this bipartisan ignorance that is fundamentally what U.S. politics is predicated on these days, where you believe your party and you don't believe anything that the other party says, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. One of the weirdest things that happened today was basically Trump going after Twitter. Twitter is now interfering with the 2020 presidential election. They're saying my statement with mail-in ballots, which led to massive corruption and fraud, is incorrect, based on fact-checking by the fake news website CNN. Here's another one. Twitter is completely stifling free speech, and I, as president, will not allow it to happen. Here's another one. Republicans feel that social media platforms totally silence conservative voices. We strongly regulate or close them down before we can ever allow this to happen. We saw this happen, or we saw this attempted to do and failed in 2016. We can't let a more sophisticated version of that pass. That's a stunt. I mean, he is talking about basically going after Twitter. Twitter is a private organization. Are there any tools that Donald Trump have in his toolbox that can actually go after Twitter in any real terms?
That's a good question. I can't predict what he's going to do, but look, this is an interesting discussion because, one, I think we should support regulation of these massive big tech corporations, but regulation and censorship are not the same thing. Regulation of a company, of a corporation that is swallowing up an entire industry, that is destroying its competitors, that is monopolizing the internet and our access to information, that is working with other big tech corporations to control the algorithm on Google so we can only see information from those big tech corporations. Those are all real issues that the government should be involved regulating. It's absolutely insane that this massive corporation, Google, basically controls all of our access to information. It's absolutely insane that Facebook can, through the use of political advertisements and targeted advertising, basically determine a presidential election in the US. Those are things that we should support regulation of because that's part of breaking up big corporate monopolies. That's different from censorship of individuals posting on those platforms. And we should not allow people like Donald Trump to conflate those two, because regulation of corporations is a good, positive, progressive reform. But censorship of individual content moves into the draconian level where the government is saying you can or can't say these things. Donald Trump intentionally is trying to conflate those two things together so he can censor his political rivals while claiming that he is regulating large corporations. He doesn't care about regulating large corporations. All he does is work with large corporations, take their money, and act on behalf of them.
Got to win the news cycle, though, Ben Norton. Got to win the news cycle at any cost. Unfortunately, we are out of time there with you, Ben Norton, an investigative journalist and assistant editor of the independent news website, The Gray Zone. Ben, where can people find more of you and your work online?
You can go to The Gray Zone. That is thegrayzone.com, and that's gray with an A. And you can follow me on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. Thanks a lot, guys. I'm really glad to see your new show. It's been fun. I've been listening before and glad to be a guest now. Thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you as a guest there, Ben Norton. Greatly appreciate it. With that, we turn to a break before coming back with our weekly Revelation segment. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate. No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. You hear that sound. It is Wednesday. That means Revelations. This is one of my favorite segments. Usually we use this time, or I use this time, to talk about UFOs. But last week we did a really interesting one dealing with basically a physics experiment that had just came out and bubbled up in the mainstream. Bob introduced me to that particular piece, and basically the outcome of the experiment was that they thought, or they hypothesized, that a contrary universe, or an alternate universe, could have been formed at the exact same time as the Big Bang, to which our universe was formed, and time was basically running in the opposite direction. Now, that piece was absolutely amazing. I was enamored by that, and so I thought, let's do another physics piece today. Bob, I'm going to bring you in on this early for this piece, because I think you'll find it interesting. So say for the moment, you had a goat, and with that goat, I gave you a box to put that goat in. We put the goat in the box, and there's nothing that escapes. You can't make any sound. You can't necessarily make any, nothing is coming out from the standpoint of sound or light, meaning whatever's in that box is a black box. You don't know what's in it. You don't know what's going on in it. Now, what's in that box, though, is a bit of radioactive isotope that decays at an unpredictable time frame, which will release a bit of poison that would kill that goat. Now, seeing as you can't necessarily see into it, seeing as you can't hear anything from that box, and knowing that this fuse will kill this goat at an unpredictable time frame, is that goat dead or alive? And why?
Well, it seems like it'd be hard for me to know.
Or is it hard for you to know?
Or could it be both?
It's both. Now the question is, why is it both? All right, now let's get interested. All right. So let's go into this part, because I wanted to be able to explain why it's both. Because the both part always blows people's minds. Like, what? It can't be both. You can't be pregnant and not pregnant at the same time. It's like, well, yeah, you could, actually. So say for the moment that you had a piece of cardboard. And say you cut two small slits out of that cardboard. And you have one golf ball. Let's say maybe 2 or 3 golf balls. Let's say you have a set of golf balls. And you can roll the golf ball through a slit. Now, if you did, you would expect the golf ball to just go through one slit or the other. And you would know that because it would hit the back of the wall. And let's say you put a little piece of paint on it, so when it hits the back of the wall, you'll know exactly where on the back it hits. You roll it through one slit, it's predictable. It goes through one. You roll it through the other slit, it's predictable. It goes through the other. Now, the catch becomes, what happens though if you don't look to figure out which slit it went through? That's when it gets interesting. Because as long as you are putting some kind of detector on the slits where you can identify where it goes through, then you will get a configuration on the back of basically a particle, meaning that ball will just hit in the back spot that you expect. The moment that you remove the detector from it and you don't look, it comes a wave. Meaning the same ball, solid object, rolled through, if you don't look at it, if you don't to figure out which one it went through, it goes through both. If you do look, it goes through one or the other. Now, this gets to what they consider to be particle-wave duality, and it's not entirely clear why particles act this way. Some people can make the argument, well, those things are interfering with one another, but not so much. Even if you just sent one through. Now, I'm saying golf balls or ping pong balls, but basically we're talking about like electrons or photons. But imagine for the moment you just send one through, and you don't peek. And as it goes through, even though it's one, it's not interfering with itself, and yet it comes back also as a wave, despite the fact you're sending a solid object through those slits. Now, this experiment gets really bizarre because they try to find and try to understand, why is this doing this? Matter doesn't fluctuate as both under our normal experience of things. It's like, is my house there when I leave? Well, it depends on whether or not somebody's looking at my house. Well, that's kind of the same thing with the goat. It depends on whether or not somebody's looking at the goat. It's almost as if you're making an argument that the goat was being pushed through 2 slits, but you didn't necessarily know which slit. So the goat, despite the fact that that goat is alive, ends up being a wave and a particle at the exact same time. Not a particle, but a goat and a dead and alive at the exact same time. It's the particle wave duality issue that is really utterly and entirely bizarre, especially from our understanding of what matter is. We think of matter as solid objects. We think of this table as hard. We think of that television as hard. But in the reality of things, when you get to the subatomic particles, most of that stuff is just empty space. I mean, if you were talking about, blowing a particle up to the size of the diamond or baseball stadium, you might have like the little tiny marble in the middle that would be like the neutron, and everything else would just be empty space. So from the standpoint of that GOAT and that particle wave duality, you are experiencing that on this kind of macro scale, something that is usually only seen on a quantum level, dealing with particles and dealing with these waveforms. Does that make sense? I'm trying to explain it in a way where it totally makes sense, but I'm trying to bring it down to this notion of...
I mean, I guess I did this in like 8th grade science class, right? Where you could like actually do the lights.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's up it a little bit. Now, if you went 1 billion years, let's say you said, okay, I'm not going to peek. I'm not going to look personally, but I'm going to have a computer, and that computer is going to register which slot these electrons, these particles go through. But you don't look at the computer. What happens? Think about it, Bob. Which one? What happens? If you take a measurement, but you don't look at the measurement, meaning you have a computer, you run this iteration like 1 billion times, and your computer has kept a record of all of the places where it's gone through. So what happens at the back? Are you going to get a wave or particle?
I think you would get both.
You would get a wave. Now, the reason you'll get a wave is because ultimately you never looked. The issue is consciousness. Basically, as long as the person, the scientist, whoever is doing the lab or whoever is doing that experiment, oftentimes we have this idea that I'm perceiving an experiment, missing the fact that you're perceiving it means you're part of the experiment. There's no way to separate the observer from the experiment that's being observed. So your consciousness has an interplay in regards to whether or not it ends up being a wave or particle. And that determination is dependent upon whether or not you look at the results. If your computer comes down with the results, but you never peek at the results, then it comes back as a wave. Now, if you save that for 1 billion years and somebody comes back later and peeks at the results, when that person looks at it, it will be a particle because at that point somebody peeked. It's weird stuff.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the movie What the Bleep Do We Know?
Yeah.
They basically talk about that where it's like everything behind you that you're not looking at right now is a wave, and you couldn't actually see it, and it doesn't actually become a particle until you look at it. And I think that's what's incredible in these new studies that are coming out, like you said, are these like kind of layers of what perspective we have on the slit experiment itself, something that's in our textbooks that kind of just tell us, hey, it's this one thing, it's kind of a crazy phenomenon. And now what we're learning is that there's like layers to this phenomenon. Jamal, I'm kind of curious, is this the path, if the UFO thing, if it's not us, is this the path that we have to walk down to understand, well, it's not us, it's because something else figured out how to go down all of these different intricate paths of physics to unleash kind of the weird unknown unknowables, and they went down these paths and figured out all these weird physics? I mean, is this the path that this is a big story because it allows us to better understand how our physics are either wrong or they're just not fully fleshed out?
Yes, it gets across that your physics is not fleshed out. I mean, like Tom Campbell. So Tom Campbell is a NASA physicist. Tom Campbell, I came across Campbell not from, believe it or not, his physics works. I came across him for his new agey stuff. He used to get into this kind of like, he used to study OBE stuff for Bob Monroe because Bob Monroe wanted to get a physicist in order to kind of get research behind him. So he brought in these kind of big name physicists. So Campbell basically comes to the conclusion and makes the argument of that basically what the double slit experiment is trying to get across is that we assume that our world is material. And what we are finding is that's not entirely true. And that the reason the double slit thing doesn't necessarily make sense is because we think that that ball is actually a real ball. Or we think that that bit of matter is actually a bit of real matter, as opposed to being a kind of thing of virtual stuff to which your consciousness engages in. Now, Campbell was trying to create an experiment in order to make it abundantly clear, meaning you couldn't walk away from it. Like you couldn't have this thing where a segment of your reality fell apart and you could just pretend like you didn't see that reality fall apart. He is trying to nail it down that this is a virtual world, not necessarily a material one. Now, the moment that happens, oh my God. Because if you're able to make that argument, right off the bat, just built into that argument is, well, what's generating the world, right? I mean, if it's not a material world, if it's something that is being generated by something else, then by definition, it has to be from somewhere else in order to generate it. This is kind of when you get into these physics, like some Einstein's and some of these other guys that get into quantum mechanics, they start making arguments like this where these guys start sounding like new age people when really they're talking about just particles and the way those particles behave at a quantum level. It's really bizarre. Even the way that they jump levels, like it doesn't necessarily take a direct path from point A to point B. It seems to just kind of appear at one spot or another spot. This stuff gets really bizarre. Einstein had this quote of God doesn't play dice with the universe because he looked at this and said, this is too weird. There's no way our universe is built this way. And yet, it was. That's like when they did the experiments. For many of the experiments, they didn't have the ability to do the experiments when they came up with the theory. It was only later on when technology got to the point where you could evaluate it. So Einstein's relativity, for example, wasn't something that they could do during the time Einstein came up with relativity. It was a thought experiment that eventually they could use when they were getting different results back from airplanes. The airplanes that were higher up were a different part of the gravity well, and because it was in a different part of the gravity well, time flew differently on the clocks. They were higher up as opposed to the clocks that were on the ground. Well, that's stuff they found out later, once technology got to the point. So the answer is yes. It is one of those things that is necessary for us to go through when we're trying to understand how this kind of weird phenomena acts. And once you figure that stuff out, it's like when you hit your head on something that you don't understand. It's fascinating. And I think that's where it goes.
And it's more annoying when you look up and it's a pipe or something that you walked into, Jamar, or at least perceived that you walked into. Yeah, I mean, it's like fascinating, all the other layers of questions that we'll have to get to in our future revelation segment about, do the people that have already figured out the physics want us to figure out the physics? And if they can go backwards in time, or whatever time means, is there ways to prevent us from finding this out? So many questions to continue to answer. That's why we try to dig into them every Wednesday here on Political Misfits in our weekly revelation segment. Jamal, always appreciate the education and the tour de force. Get it, a force joke there when it comes to understanding physics a little bit better. With that, though, Jamal, we do need to take one last break before we come back with a few stories that we do not want to miss out. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of still with Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl, just about 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Big thank you to all of our callers out there, all of our listeners, and those watching us on the Progressive Soapbox YouTube channel. Make sure to like, comment, and share the feed. You can always check us out on Facebook, on Twitter, at Sputnik Misfits. And if you're not able to listen to our show live, you can always go into the podcast archives, wherever you listen to podcasts, and search for Political Misfits there. Jamarl Thomas, a few more stories we wanted to get to before we have to close out for the day. I wanted to start here in Canada. In a masterclass in reading the room, the energy minister of the Canadian state of Alberta gave some great quotes on a podcast recently. Sonia Savage spoke to a podcast of the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling and Contractors about the Trans Mountain oil pipeline that some Indigenous groups and environmentalists are trying to shut down. Let's not miss an opportunity, the minister said. Quote, now is a great time to be building a pipeline because you can't have protests of more than 15 people, were her actual words. Let's get it built. This, in a nutshell, what a lot of genuinely fear will happen during and after this lockdown, that the tiny cohort of people with most of the world's money and power will see how easy it is to do what they like when people can be physically barred from organizing and find ways to continue the situation. So thanks for saying the quiet part out loud, Miss Savage. A savage decision by Sonia Savage there in Canada.
Yeah, it was a savage decision by Sonia Savage. I love that name. Yeah, that's amazing, right? She's saying that aloud. That puts me in the mind of that Republican that was in, I think, Pennsylvania. And he said something like, yeah, now voter ID laws are going to help Mitt Romney win this state. It's like, whoa, dude, you weren't supposed to say that. It's like, don't say that part. Ixnay on the win the state stuff. That's funny. It's true. I mean, basically, what did Alan Greenspan say at that time? People being insecure, not having their needs met, basically helps the economy because those people can't protest. It's the same thing.
Yeah, and speaking of protest, I'm fascinated because I wanted to go out and protest here in the District of Washington, D.C. Muriel Bowser and the transition team featuring Michael Serkis and Susan Rice, some old has-beens from the Bush and from the Obama administration, were tasked with reopening the city now. Jamar, get this. The city said we'll start into our second phase of reopening the city if we have 14 continuous days of a decrease in number of new COVID cases. And here in the Washington Post, it writes, over the weekend, the district hit a setback in achieving a 2-week decline in the virus spread after recording a single-day spike in new cases from 68 on May 12th to 118 on May 13th. But instead of resetting the 14-day clock to 0, the district removed the 2 days that showed that spike, meaning the city would still be able to begin reopening on Friday as the mayor had floated. I was laughing. I was saying, like in school at a young age, your teacher would always make a point that the bell didn't matter. It was the teacher that released you. And they would do that thing where not until everybody for 1 minute stays completely quiet are you all allowed to leave. And then obviously Billy at the 50-second mark has to start snickering right before everybody gets there. And you say, all right, well, another minute. But the teacher never lets Billy and the rest of the class out early, because the second Billy gets let out early after 50 seconds, then the teacher loses all control and say and respect of the student. So now you have the mayor basically saying, oh, I know I made these super important rules and I told everybody it was super important to follow the rules, but we were close enough. Let's just throw it out at this point. It's absurd, Jamaro.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. I mean, if you're going to say, all right, we're going to wait for 10 days, because basically the 10 days is supposed to, the 14 days is basically supposed to be, all right, this is getting under control. We've been able to go from multiple days, and we've been able to show a trend line that is going down, trending down. We've been doing a great job with our social distancing, so let's make this work. Well, the moment that doesn't happen, and the social distancing kind of, doesn't do all that great, or your numbers start to go back up, then maybe you're doing something wrong. Like maybe you need a re-understanding of it. For example, in Wisconsin, the election in Wisconsin, they were able to find that election actually did get people infected with coronavirus or COVID-19. But that's well, of course you are, because you have this kind of large number of people who are coming together. Right at the end, Memorial Day, all of these people at the beach, all of these were just close together.
They were at day 12. They said, we're almost there. It's day 12 and Memorial Day is now here. Good luck.
Yeah, right. We're close enough. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, they're talking about new spikes in the disease thing. It's such a wild card. It's very surreal. Even us, I don't know when we go back. It's for us, we've been kind of in this thing of, okay, well, I take the subway. And initially when all of this started, my thought was, okay, well, I prefer to do the job at the job, at the company. And then at some point it was yeah, that's probably not safe. And now I kind of look at it as, all right, well, I would prefer to be safe as opposed to kind of just risk it for a radio show. I would imagine people feel
I think that's the thing, right? A lot of people are going to stay home, and a master class of how to avoid accountability for all this. I think that's the other thing, right? Is Muriel Bowser, the mayor of DC, held accountable if any of this all goes wrong? And we're seeing here, and Andrew Cuomo has been thinking that same thing. How do I avoid being held responsible, or any of my big time donors being held responsible? So you know what? You get creative. Let me tell you this story from New York, Jamal. So a little less than 2 years ago, the Greater New York Hospital Association gave $1.25 million to Andrew Cuomo's controlled New York State Democratic Committee that was supporting the governor's re-election bid. So what do you get, Jamal, for $1.25 million? Well, last month, it turns out that Andrew Cuomo signed legislation shielding hospitals and nursing home executives from the threat of lawsuits stemming from the coronavirus outbreak. The provision, inserted into an annual budget bill by Cuomo's aides, created one of the nation's most explicit immunity protections for healthcare industry officials, according to legal experts. New York is now one of just 2 states to shield these corporate officials from both civil lawsuits and some forms of criminal prosecution by the government, according to analysis by Syracuse law professor Nia Cohn. Cohn said in an interview, New York is an outlier and has the most explicit and sweeping immunity language. The new law declares that top officials at hospital and nursing home companies shall have immunity from any liability, civil or criminal, for any harm or damages alleged to have been sustained as a result of an act or omission in the course of arranging for or providing healthcare services to address COVID-19 outbreak. This, Jamal, is yet another reason that the Democratic Party has no interest in healthcare for all. It would, one, stop donations coming in from these huge private medical providers. Two, would actually make the government and elected officials accountable. Cuomo's shell game shows that he has the power to basically make himself and his donors unaccountable to the people, and they have no interest in changing that calculus.
Yeah, that's sad. I mean, and whatever is taking place in New York right now, will also, I would strongly suspect, I will make this prediction, will take place over the entire United States. I mean, the Republican Party is pushing for it. I keep telling, the Democratic Party is owned by the exact same people that own the Republican Party. You know, so whatever that least worst political, Chinese finger trap that these guys use, ultimately they're still paid by the same people. And so do I believe that these companies, the ownership class, are going to want protections to ensure that people don't get ill going back to their restaurants? Yes, I absolutely think they would want that. And so the Republican Party, who's pushing that real hard, I would imagine the Democratic Party basically let it pass. And they're going to say, well, we didn't have a choice. We didn't have a choice. They forced us.
Yeah, well, in another story of bipartisanship, the Justice Department closed investigations into 3 of 4 U.S. senators for stock trades, Jamal, made shortly before the coronavirus market turmoil. I know you saw this. They say bipartisan jokingly because the 3 that were left off, Republicans Kelly Loeffler of Georgia, James Inhofe of Oklahoma, and Democrat Dianne Feinstein. That's right. Here in Washington, D.C., we equally don't prosecute or hold any of these elected officials accountable, Democrat or Republican, Jamal Thomas. The DOJ investigation.
Like you said, it's like equal opportunity, not prosecute
equal opportunity is not to charge anyone for insider trading. The DOJ investigation into one Republican Senator, Richard Burr, however, will continue, according to people familiar with the matter. Mr. Burr of North Carolina had more direct involvement in his trades than other senators and said he was relying on news reports coming in out of Asia, where the virus first emerged, to make his investment decisions. I guess the secret intel committee reports are from Asia, so maybe that's where he's trying to go to. However, investigators, Jamal, have obtained evidence that showed Mr. Burr was talking to people with specific insight about the threats posed by COVID-19, whose thinking wasn't available to the public. According to the Wall Street Journal, Mr. Burr, who sits on 2 committees that receive detailed briefings on the growing epidemic, including one on January 24th, sold shares on February 13th of companies worth as much as $1.7 million that he owns with his wife. That saved the couple at least $250,000 in losses based on what those stocks were worth at the close of trading on March 19th. Jamal Thomas, do more people die than money saved by Mr. Burr, which was $250,000?
Oh, that's interesting. Yes.
Yeah, think
I'm
about
going to say
that.
yes.
Right? Yeah, wow.
The only reason I'm saying yes is because many of these states have started lying about how bad their cases are. Like you made the point about New York. I mean, Washington, D.C., where they were like, well, two days, that's not bad. We'll just let that ride. And I think you're going to get a situation where some of these places, hotspots, will develop. I don't know how you get away from it. Even, like, what was the beauty parlor thing where it was like 2 beauty parlors had exposed 150 people to a potential just for the haircut that these guys were getting at the hair cuttery?
I'm interested too if like there's backlash for these businesses, if there's like a stigma like, oh yeah, it's Sally's nail salon, that's where everybody got COVID, and then like she's gone forever. It'll be really interesting to see kind of this fight and battle, because we're going to see tensions rise, I think, as numbers respike and there's not a move to stay at home anymore.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, look, people are getting tired. I mean, we were going through the polling ourselves, where you could see either among Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all of those numbers have started to move down of like, oh God, I'm just ready to get out the house. So it's like, no, I don't want to die. No, I don't want to get ill. Yes, I do want to get out of the house. I am sick of this. And I agree with those people, so I am there with them. But for that, we're going to have to end it and close it on this note. I want to thank all of our guests, Sean Blackman, The Voice, Ben Norton. I also want to thank Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul and the entire Sputnik News team. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty, who's always witty. And on behalf of Bob Schlehuber and myself, Jamal Thomas, I want to thank you guys for listening. Now get back to organizing. I'm stealing your word, Bob. Get back to organizing. Thanks all. Guys, thank you all. I appreciate all of you for joining us for the show, as always. And I'm going to check on the Mrs. Let me see. Charles Cavan compiled the right videos and they will be effective. Charles, I agree with you on that. Like when Donald Trump, Trump released the video on going after Joe Biden. And he went after Joe Biden on the crime bill, which I said he was going to do. He went after him on the You Ain't Black, that video. But he also went on Joe Biden against, on top of the You Ain't Black video, he started adding other stuff into it. Like Joe Biden basically saying stuff about Obama being clean and articulate or something like that. The video that he should have added in was Joe Biden saying, black folks can't take care of their kids. And then immediately pivot to Zerlina Maxwell, who's like, oh my God, that is so racist. Like, that's what you need. Because Zerlina Maxwell's response was perfect. Her response was pitch perfect. Because she was shocked by the whole thing. And she's talking to the other person, the announcer, and the announcer, a white woman, is not getting it. Like, she's not getting it at all. She was like, that's the most racist thing I've ever heard. And she was like, I don't see it. She was like, you really think people are going to hear that? She was like, I don't give a shit whether people can hear it or not. I heard it. That's, utterly horrendous. And so I agree with you, Charles. I do think ads, especially depending on the argument that you make on those ads, can back up a particular point of view that you're trying to kind of pierce and push through. But unfortunately, the guy who we were backing didn't believe in opposition research. So here we are. Fred Edwards, what's going on, Fred? Paul, what's going on, Paul? Let's see, fuck Google, what's happening, fuck Google? All right, I'm going to end this here. Ryan, I think Garden, saw Garden somewhere. All right, guys, like, share, and I'll see you.